Finally free. Ethan Caldwell laughed right there in the courtroom, loud enough for everyone to hear, loud enough for his wife to hear the moment the judge finalized their divorce and handed him everything. He straightened his jacket, turned toward the door, and did not look back once at the woman who had given him 6 years of her life. Not once. And in the back row, an old man in a plain gray jacket watched that laugh, said nothing, and began to make a phone call. If you're new here, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The laugh was the part Claire would remember longest. Not the judge's words, not the sound of the gavel, not even the moment Ethan's attorney slid the final asset division documents across the table with a smile that said, "We won. We really won." What Claire would carry with her in the quiet hours after, in the weeks that followed, in the years she would spend rebuilding herself from the ground up was that laugh. Short, satisfied. The laugh of a man who believed he had just gotten away with something. She had known Ethan Caldwell for 8 years, loved him for 7, been married to him for 6, and in all that time she had never once heard him laugh like that, careless, unguarded. The kind of laugh a person makes when they believe no one important is watching. The problem, the catastrophic life-altering problem that Ethan would not understand until it was far too late, was that someone very important was watching. He just didn't know who. Claire had arrived at the courthouse that morning the way she had arrived at every difficult moment in her adult life, quietly and alone. Her attorney, Daniel Marsh, had met her in the lobby. Daniel was a kind man, methodical and careful, and he had been honest with her from the beginning of this process. Too honest, she sometimes thought. Claire, he had said that morning, adjusting his briefcase strap and looking at her with the expression of a man delivering weather. He wished he could change. "I want you to be prepared. Ethan's team has been thorough. The financial documentation they've submitted, the accounts, the transfers, the property records, it's been constructed very deliberately. The narrative they're telling is coherent." "I know," she said. "I've challenged everything I legally can. But I need you to understand that the judge may rule in his favor on the apartment, on the investment portfolio." "I know, Daniel." He hesitated. "You keep saying that, but I'm not sure you're prepared for what it feels like when—" "I've been prepared for a long time," she said, and her voice was steady, and she meant it, and that was the part Daniel could not quite understand. She didn't look like a woman bracing for a loss. She looked like a woman waiting for something to begin. The courtroom was smaller than people imagined when they thought about the word courtroom. There was nothing grand about it. Fluorescent lighting, wood paneling that had been refinished once too many times, rows of benches that creaked when people shifted their weight. It smelled faintly of old coffee and the particular anxiety of people who had arrived hoping for justice and were not entirely sure they would find it. Ethan was already seated when Claire walked in. He was wearing the charcoal suit, the one she had helped him pick out 3 years ago for a merger presentation, back when she still believed in the version of their marriage that existed only in her hope. He had his arms folded, posture relaxed, the casual confidence of a man who had already rehearsed this moment and decided how it ended. He didn't look at her when she sat down. His attorney, Marcus Vane, was a different kind of person entirely, the kind of attorney who billed by the quarter hour and made sure you felt every quarter. He had silver cufflinks and a way of speaking to opposing counsel that made everything sound slightly like an insult, dressed in formal language. He had arranged Ethan's case with genuine skill, and Claire would not pretend otherwise. The problem was that Marcus Vane, for all his precision, had been working with incomplete information. And incomplete information in the hands of even a skilled person is still a map of a country that doesn't quite exist. The proceedings had begun 2 hours earlier, and from the first minutes, Claire understood exactly how Ethan intended to tell this story. She was the problem. She had always been the problem. A woman who didn't understand ambition, who resisted growth, who refused to engage with the social architecture that a man like Ethan required to climb. His attorney painted her in gentle but devastating strokes, a wife who had chosen comfort over contribution, who had declined opportunities to build alongside her husband, who had in fact quietly withdrawn from the financial infrastructure of their marriage in ways that required investigation and explanation. Claire sat still through all of it. Her attorney objected where he could. He challenged account records, questioned the provenance of certain transfer documents, raised procedural issues that slowed the momentum. But Ethan's team had prepared for every objection, and the session moved forward with the particular efficiency of a plan that had been rehearsed. Ethan did not look at her once during his attorney's presentation. Claire looked at him the entire time. She was not studying him with hatred. She had moved past hatred months ago, and the movement had not been easy. Hatred requires energy, and Claire had spent too many years giving Ethan every form of energy she had. What she felt now, watching him sit there with his rehearsed confidence and his charcoal suit, was something quieter and in some ways more profound. She felt sorry for him. Not the soft, pitying kind of sorry, the hard kind. The kind that comes when you watch someone make an irreversible choice and you understand with full clarity exactly what it is going to cost them. Marcus Vane rose to deliver his closing summary, and he was good at this part, the part where all the individual threads were woven into a single fabric that was meant to feel inevitable. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying the measured confidence of someone who had done this hundreds of times. The evidence before this court demonstrates clearly that the marriage between Ethan Caldwell and Claire Whitmore has dissolved due to fundamental incompatibility and Mrs. Caldwell's consistent failure to engage as a productive partner in the financial life of this union. My client built his career through exceptional effort and discipline. The assets in question, the Park Avenue property, the investment accounts, the shared financial portfolio were built primarily through my client's professional contributions. We ask the court to recognize this reality in the final division. The judge, a woman named Honorable Patricia Sweeney, who had presided over family court for 23 years and had heard every version of this particular argument that human creativity could produce, listened with an expression of professional neutrality that revealed nothing. Daniel Marsh offered his counter-summary. He was good and he was honest, and he made the strongest case the available evidence allowed him to make. He talked about Claire's contributions to the household infrastructure that allowed Ethan to dedicate himself entirely to his career. He talked about the emotional and logistical labor that never appeared in financial documents. He challenged the characterization of the asset origins. It was good work, but when the judge began speaking, Claire understood within the first 30 seconds that it had not been quite enough. The ruling came in measured legal language, the way all significant things in courtrooms come wrapped in procedure so that the weight of them doesn't land all at once. The Park Avenue apartment awarded to Ethan Caldwell. The primary investment portfolio awarded to Ethan Caldwell pending final valuation. Claire's settlement, a figure that sounded reasonable in isolation until you understood what it was measured against. Daniel Marsh pressed his lips together. He turned to Claire with an expression of professional apology that she could see was genuine and could see was not going to change anything. Claire nodded once. She was not surprised. She had known this was one possible outcome. She had prepared for it. And yet there was something about hearing the words spoken aloud officially by a person with legal authority that still carried a different kind of weight than anticipation. She was steady. She was still. She was watching Ethan, and that was when he did it. Ethan Caldwell, Wall Street executive man of careful public presentation person who had spent 6 years performing the version of himself. He believed the world required. Ethan Caldwell stood up from his chair before the judge had even collected her papers, turned toward the back of the courtroom where Victoria Lane was waiting near the doors, with a smile that could have been a billboard for everything wrong with every choice he had made in the last 18 months, and he laughed. Finally free, 2 words, delivered with the lightness of someone who had just dropped a bag he'd been carrying for years and couldn't believe how good it felt to set it down. The sound moved through the courtroom like something physical. Several people flinched. The court reporter stopped typing for half a second. Judge Sweeney's expression shifted barely, but it shifted, and in 23 years of family court, that shift meant something. Daniel Marsh exhaled through his nose. Marcus Vane had the practiced presence of mind to immediately occupy himself with his briefcase. Claire did not flinch. She turned toward her ex-husband. The word was official. Now she could use it now, and she looked at him with the kind of clear, undecorated gaze that a person only achieves after they have cried every tear they had and come out the other side of something enormous. She felt something in her chest that was not grief, was not rage, was not the complicated tangle of emotions she had expected to feel in this moment. It was closer to recognition. There it is, she thought. That's who you always were. What happened next was quiet and quick and entirely missed by Ethan, who was already mentally halfway out the door. In the back row of the courtroom, a man who had been sitting perfectly still for the past 2 hours, a man in a simple gray jacket, no tie, no briefcase, no indication of anything except a person who had come to watch, stood up. He moved without hurry. I was 68 years old, and he had the particular stillness of someone who had made enough consequential decisions in his life that urgency had long since become unnecessary. He was not tall or imposing. His jacket was the kind you'd find in the closet of a retired teacher. His shoes were good, but understated. There was nothing about the exterior of him that announced what was underneath. He had been in that back row since before the proceedings began. He had said nothing. He had watched everything. Claire had seen him when she walked in. She had registered his presence the way you register the presence of something deeply familiar in an unfamiliar place, a quick, involuntary arrest of attention, followed by a long, steadying breath. She had not gone to him. She had not acknowledged him in any visible way, because that was not the agreement. "Are you sure?" the man said, and his voice was not loud, but it carried the way voices carry when the person speaking has absolute confidence that they will be heard, that you understand what you just won. The courtroom had been beginning to disperse. People gathering papers, attorneys exchanging professional acknowledgments, the court reporter preparing her equipment for transport. At the sound of that voice, every motion in the room decelerated. Ethan turned. He looked at the older man with the expression of someone encountering an unexpected interruption, mildly annoyed, mildly curious, already calculating whether this was something worth engaging with. "Excuse me," he said. The man didn't answer immediately. He moved through the gate that separated the gallery from the court floor with the ease of someone who had not waited for permission to enter rooms in a very long time. Judge Sweeney, who had seen genuinely everything, looked up from her papers with an expression of professional attention. "Sir," she said carefully, "proceedings have concluded. If you have a matter to bring before—" "I apologize for the interruption, Your Honor," the man said, and the courtesy in his voice was the real kind, not the performative kind. "My name is Richard Whitmore. I have documentation that I believe is relevant to the assets this court has just addressed." He paused. "With your permission." The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Judge Sweeney went very still. Marcus Vane's hand, which had been moving toward the clasp of his briefcase, stopped moving. Daniel Marsh turned to look at Claire with an expression that she could only describe as stunned professional recalibration. Ethan stared at the older man. He stared at him for a long moment. And then Claire, from her seat across the room, said it so quietly that only the people nearest her heard it. "Dad?" Later, much later, in the months of reconfiguring that followed, when Claire would have conversations about this day with people who had not been present, she would struggle to explain what it was like to watch Ethan Caldwell's face in the seconds after that single word left her mouth. There are expressions the human face makes that are not quite emotions. They are more like the space between emotions, the gap where a person's established understanding of reality cracks, and the light comes through before the mind has decided what to do next. Ethan's face did something like that. His mouth opened slightly. His eyes moved between the man, between Richard Whitmore, between her father and Claire, and back again. She could see him running calculations, matching data, trying to reconcile what he was looking at with the story he had been telling himself for 6 years. Claire had mentioned her father, of course. Over the years, she had mentioned him the way you mention someone you love, who lives at a careful distance from the parts of your life you're trying to protect, which is to say, briefly, gently, and without detail. She had said he was a businessman. She had said he preferred a quiet life. She had described him once early in their marriage as someone who had done well for himself, and Ethan had made a mildly dismissive sound and moved the conversation to something he considered more relevant. He had never asked to meet him. He had never been curious, because Ethan Caldwell, for all his intelligence and all his strategic thinking, had a particular blind spot. He categorized people early and revised almost never. Claire had been categorized as ordinary within the first year of their marriage, and once that category was applied, everything she said and did and came from was filtered through it. Her father was a quiet old man who lived away from the spotlight. That was the category. That was all the information Ethan had ever needed. "I don't understand," Ethan said finally, and his voice had a quality to it that Claire had almost never heard before. Something thin, something unsupported. Richard Whitmore, her father said, and his tone was the same regardless of who he was speaking to. Patient, clear, entirely without performance. Founder and chairman of Whitmore Capital Group, though I expect that information may require a moment to process. Ethan's attorney, Marcus Vane, was staring at his client with an expression that a very expensive divorce attorney wears when he understands that his client had fundamental information and failed to share it, or more terrifyingly, had genuinely not known. "Your Honor," Richard said, turning to address the bench directly, "I have documentation I'd like to submit. It pertains directly to the properties ruled upon today and specifically to the legal structure under which those properties were held during the duration of this marriage." Judge Sweeney looked at the documents her clerk accepted and passed to her. She read the first page, then the second. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but her reading slowed, which was its own kind of signal. "Mr. Vane," she said without looking up, "were you aware of the existence of the Whitmore Family Trust in relation to the Park Avenue property?" The silence that followed lasted approximately 4 seconds. In a courtroom, 4 seconds is an eternity. "I was not, Your Honor," Marcus Vane said, and whatever he was feeling in that moment, his voice was professionally controlled. He turned to Ethan with a look that communicated several very pointed things without using words. Ethan was staring at the documents. He was very still. "Mr. Caldwell," the judge said, "were you aware of the trust?" Another pause, shorter this time. "No," he said. And the thing was, the complicated, painful, ultimately important thing, he was telling the truth. Claire had told him once. It was early in their marriage, before the distance set in, before she had learned to measure what she shared and what she protected. They had been sitting together on an evening she still remembered, with the peculiar sharpness that certain moments acquire when you understand later how significant they were, not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. "My family has money," she had said simply, honestly, because she believed in honesty and she was trying to build something real. "More than I've told you. I've been careful about it because—" and she'd paused, searching for words that were true without being frightening. "I want to know that the life we're building is ours, not because of what I come from." Ethan had been half reading something on his phone. He had looked up briefly. "Everyone's family has money somewhere," he had said with the easy generosity of someone who had already filed this information under not particularly interesting. "That doesn't change anything." She had looked at him for a moment longer than he noticed. "No," she said, "it doesn't." And she had decided in that moment that the test was not one she would announce, that she would simply live her life with him honestly as herself, and that the truth would eventually reveal whatever needed to be revealed. She had been right. It had simply taken 6 years and 1 courtroom and 1 laugh. "The property at Park Avenue," Richard Whitmore said, addressing the court with the calm efficiency of a man who had delivered significant information many times before and understood that clarity served everyone better than drama, "was purchased through a structured arrangement between my daughter and the Whitmore Family Trust prior to her marriage to Mr. Caldwell. The trust document contains a reversion clause, standard language but specific in the event that the marriage terminates due to documented financial misconduct or infidelity on the part of the non-Whitmore spouse. Beneficial ownership of the property reverts to the trust." He set a document on the clerk's desk. "That reversion clause," he continued, "was triggered 8 months ago." Ethan's head came up sharply. "What?" "8 months ago," Richard repeated, and there was nothing cruel in his repetition. It was simply precise. "Which is when independent documentation of the financial transfers your attorneys presented today as evidence of your wife's financial irresponsibility was first reviewed by our trust attorneys. Those transfers did not demonstrate Claire's irresponsibility." He paused. "They demonstrated yours." The room was absolutely silent. "The accounts your legal team characterized as evidence of Claire's mismanagement," Richard said, "were traced through 2 intermediary accounts to a management entity registered in Delaware 4 years ago. That entity has a single beneficial owner." He looked at Ethan directly for the first time. "You're familiar with it, I believe." Ethan had gone the color of old paper. Marcus Vane did something then that in another context might have been almost admirable. He closed his briefcase. He set it on the floor beside his chair. He sat down. It was the physical language of an attorney who has just understood that he has been building a case on a foundation that his client neglected to inform him was hollow, and who is now engaged in the professional equivalent of very carefully placing fragile items on a stable surface before anything else can break. "Your Honor," Daniel Marsh said, and his voice had acquired a quality it had not carried for the past 2 hours, something controlled but unmistakably energized. In light of this new documentation, I would request that the court suspend implementation of the asset ruling pending a full review of the financial records pertaining to both parties. Judge Sweeney was still reading. "So noted," she said without looking up. "Mr. Whitmore, is this documentation available for full submission to the court?" "Completely," Richard said, "including forensic accounting analysis and correspondence records." "Correspondence records," the judge repeated, and now she looked up. "Yes," Richard said, "including records of communications between Mr. Caldwell and a third party beginning approximately 22 months ago, relevant to both the management of marital assets and the circumstances of the marriage's dissolution." 22 months ago, 4 months before Ethan had told Claire he wanted a divorce. Claire looked at the surface of the table in front of her and breathed slowly through her nose. She had known this. She had known it, and she had processed it, and she had done the work of moving through it. But there was still something about hearing it documented official placed on the public record of a proceeding. There was still something about that which required a separate effort. She felt her father's attention from across the room. She did not look up at him. But she felt it the way you feel the presence of something steady when the ground shifts. "I have a question," Ethan said suddenly, and his voice had changed again. The thinness was gone, replaced by something harder, something that might have been anger or might have been fear, and was probably both. "I have a question about all of this." No one in the room stopped him. "She knew," he said. He was looking at Claire now directly for the first time since they'd entered the courtroom. "She knew the whole time, about the trust, about—" He stopped, recalibrated. "She never told me any of this. She let me—" He caught himself again. "She let you make your own choices," Richard said, and his voice was still even, still patient, still entirely without the satisfaction that Ethan would have displayed in the same position, without the interference of information that might have altered your motivation. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. This one had weight. "You're telling me," Ethan said slowly, "that she was doing some kind of test." "I'm telling you," Richard said, "that my daughter married a man she loved, and that the man she loved made a series of choices over the course of their marriage that had nothing to do with the presence or absence of a trust document. The trust document simply recorded what those choices were worth in legal terms." He paused. "The human cost was calculated separately." Ethan stared at him. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at Claire. And Claire, for the first time in the entire proceeding, held his gaze fully without looking away, without softening it, without the instinct to make things easier that had governed so much of their 6 years together. She held his gaze, and she let him see her clearly, not the defeated woman he had imagined walking out of this courtroom, not the ordinary wife he had categorized and dismissed, but herself, the actual person, the woman who had chosen him and loved him and kept his secret so he could discover himself, and watched him discover someone she did not recognize. She held his gaze, and then she looked away. Not because she had lost, because she was done. The court session was extended by 40 minutes, while Judge Sweeney reviewed the submitted documentation and consulted briefly with her clerk. During that time, Ethan sat motionless at his table. His attorney remained professionally present, but spoke to him only once, leaning close and saying something in a very low voice that made Ethan close his eyes for approximately 5 seconds. Victoria Lane, who had been waiting near the doors throughout all of this, was gone. Claire had not seen her leave. Nobody seemed to have noticed the moment it happened. She was simply there, and then she was not, which was in itself a kind of information. Richard Whitmore sat in the gallery and responded to 2 text messages with the particular thumb economy of someone who has never treated a phone as a primary communication device. He did not look concerned. He looked like a man waiting for a train that was running slightly behind schedule. Daniel Marsh came to sit beside Claire during the wait. "I want to ask you something," he said quietly. "And I want you to understand I'm asking as your attorney, not as someone with any kind of judgment about anything." "Go ahead," she said. "How long have you known this was coming, that your father was here, that the trust documentation would be submitted?" Claire was quiet for a moment. "I called my father 8 months ago," she said, "after I found the transfers, after I understood what Ethan had been doing with the accounts. I called him, and I told him what I knew, and I told him I wasn't going to fight back directly. I told him I was going to let Ethan do what he was going to do, and I was going to watch what choices he made when he thought there were no consequences. Daniel was quiet. He asked me if I was sure, she continued. He asked me twice. He said he could intervene at any point, and he asked if I was certain I wanted to go through the full proceeding before he submitted anything. She paused. I said yes. I said I needed it to be fully, completely his choice, with no intervention, no warning, just whatever he was with nothing stopping him from being it. And the laugh, Daniel said, when he laughed, that was, she stopped, started again. That was the answer to a question I'd been asking for 6 years. She looked at her hands. I got my answer. When Judge Sweeney returned her full attention to the proceeding, her manner had the particular quality of a person who has reviewed documentation and found it considerably more significant than anticipated. In light of the materials submitted by Mr. Whitmore, she said, this court is ordering a full suspension of the asset ruling, pending forensic review of the financial records of both parties across the full duration of the marriage. I am further referring evidence of potential financial misconduct to the appropriate regulatory bodies. She looked at Ethan with the expression of someone who has seen this particular story many times and finds it neither surprising nor acceptable. Mr. Caldwell, I strongly recommend that you retain counsel with experience in financial compliance matters. The documentation submitted today suggests questions that extend considerably beyond the scope of divorce proceedings. She gathered her papers. She stood. Court is recessed. The courtroom did not erupt. That was the thing about real life. It rarely erupted the way the dramatic version of events suggested it should. People gathered their things. They moved carefully. They spoke in the measured tones of people who were processing something significant and had decided collectively to do it with dignity. Ethan stood at his table for a long moment after everyone else had begun moving. He looked like a person who had arrived at a destination and found it completely unrecognizable had pulled up to an address. He had been certain of stepped out of the car and discovered that the building was not what he'd expected. The street was not what he'd expected. And the map he'd been using had been oriented incorrectly from the start. He looked, Claire thought, watching him from across the room as she collected her bag and her coat. He looked genuinely lost. She had spent months bracing for what she would feel in this moment. She had expected some complicated combination of vindication and grief. She had expected something that felt like victory, or something that felt like loss, or something that didn't have a name yet, but would announce itself with force. What she felt was quieter than any of those things. She felt finished. Not finished in the way of endings. Finished in the way of something that has been completed, a piece of work that has taken its full time and now exists in its final form, separate from you, requiring nothing more. She felt finished, and she felt tired, and underneath both of those things, she felt something she hadn't fully allowed herself to feel for a very long time. She felt ready. Her father met her at the door to the courtroom. He did not hug her immediately. He looked at her first, the way he had looked at her entire life, with attention, with the specific quality of presence that meant he was actually seeing her, not performing, seeing her, not checking a paternal box. "You all right?" he said. "I will be," she said. He nodded. He understood the difference between yes and I will be, and he had always understood it, which was one of the reasons she had called him before she'd called anyone else 8 months ago, and one of the reasons she trusted that today would become something she could live through. He put a hand briefly on her shoulder. "You were remarkable in there," he said. "I didn't say anything," she said. "I know," he said, and somehow that was the right answer. Behind them, Ethan's voice carried across the now mostly empty room, lower than his courtroom voice stripped of its performance, calling her name in the particular register of a person who has just understood that they are standing at the edge of something irreversible and is looking for a handhold. "Claire." She stopped. She turned. I was standing in the middle of the room, his charcoal jacket slightly less perfect than it had been 2 hours ago, his certainty entirely absent the version of himself he had performed all morning gone, somewhere that she suspected he would spend considerable time trying to locate. He looked at her. He did not speak for a moment, and then he said, "I didn't know." It was not quite an apology. It was not quite an explanation. It was the beginning of something that was trying to be both and hadn't found its shape yet. Claire looked at him for a long moment. "I know you didn't," she said. "Then why?" "Because," she said, and her voice was steady and calm and held everything she had learned in the last 8 months, the last 6 years, the entire complicated span of loving someone you were watching, reveal themselves in slow motion. Not knowing is not the same as not choosing Ethan. She held his gaze. You chose, every time. You made every choice you made because that's who you were choosing to be. And I watched, and I let you. And now we're here. She said nothing more. She turned. She walked out of the courtroom beside her father into the light of the hallway, into the beginning of whatever came next. Behind her, the door swung closed, and for the first time in 6 years, the choice of what that closing meant was entirely hers. The hallway outside the courtroom was long and pale and full of people moving in every direction, and Claire walked through all of it without stopping. Her father matched her pace without comment. That was one of the things she had always loved about Richard Whitmore. He understood the difference between presence and intrusion, and he had spent her entire life standing close enough to catch her without standing so close she couldn't fall. They reached the end of the hallway, and she pushed through the heavy door, and the air outside hit her face and she stopped walking. She stood still for approximately 10 seconds. Then she exhaled. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of exhale that movies would score with swelling strings. It was the exhale of a person who has been holding their breath for a very long time and has finally, in the privacy of an ordinary moment, allowed themselves to stop. Okay, she said to no one and to both of them. Okay, her father agreed. They found a bench. Not because either of them needed to sit exactly, but because standing in the middle of a public space while you reorganize your understanding of your own life has a slightly unhinged quality that a bench corrects. Richard sat with his hands on his knees, a posture she'd known since childhood, relaxed but attentive, the posture of a man who was always ready for the next thing without rushing toward it. His attorney didn't know, Claire said. It wasn't a question. No, her father confirmed. Vane is good at his job. If he'd known about the trust structure, he'd have built his entire case differently. Ethan didn't tell him because Ethan didn't know. He paused. Which tells you something about how thoroughly he'd categorized you. He thought I had nothing, she said. He thought you had nothing worth investigating, Richard corrected gently. Those are different things. One is about you, the other is about him. Claire turned that over for a moment. The forensic review, she said. What are they going to find? Her father looked at her with the particular patience of someone who has been waiting for the right question. The transfers Ethan's team tried to characterize as your financial irresponsibility traced back to a Delaware LLC he formed 4 years ago. He's been routing money from your joint accounts into it in amounts small enough to avoid automatic flags. Over 4 years it comes to a significant sum, he said the number. Claire was quiet. The number was significant. He was building an exit, she said. He was building a cushion, her father said. He wanted to leave the marriage with enough independent capital that the divorce settlement was secondary. He planned to be financially comfortable regardless of what you were awarded. The settlement was theater. The real money was already moved. And the regulatory referral, she said. Judge Sweeney mentioned, 2 of the accounts he used to route the money had overlap with accounts connected to his employer. He was not always careful about the separations. Her father paused again, the kind of pause that is a door slightly ajar. There are people at his firm who are going to have very uncomfortable conversations in the next several weeks. Claire pressed her fingers to her eyes for a moment. Not from grief, from the sheer complexity of it, the layers upon layers of construction that Ethan had built, the architecture of deception that he had maintained while sitting across from her at breakfast and telling her the orange juice was too pulpy and asking whether she'd remembered to pick up his dry cleaning. He was so normal, she said. That's the part I keep coming back to. He was so normal while he was doing all of it. People usually are, Richard said, without bitterness, without performance. Just as a fact. The ones who are most deliberate about it learn very quickly that normal is the best cover. She lowered her hands. I have to call Daniel, she said. He's going to have questions. He's going to have many questions. Her father agreed with something that was not quite amusement, but lived in the same neighborhood. She pulled out her phone. Before she dialed, she looked at her father. Thank you for coming, she said. You didn't have to do it the way you did. You could have submitted everything through attorneys. You didn't have to be there in person. Richard Whitmore looked at his daughter with an expression that crossed through several things before it settled. He laughed at you, he said. In a courtroom. in front of witnesses. He stood up before the judge had left the bench and he laughed. He said it without heat, without volume, but the weight of it was absolute. I was going to be in that room. Claire held her father's gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. She dialed Daniel Marsh. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he'd been holding his phone. "Tell me you're all right," he said immediately. "I'm all right," she said. "I need about an hour, and then I need to sit down with you and go through everything that was submitted today." "I've already started pulling it," he said. "Claire, I have to ask you something, and I need you to understand. I'm asking as someone who is now actively working to protect your interests, not as someone who has any concern about your judgment." "Ask," she said. "The forensic accounting firm that prepared the documentation your father submitted, the trust attorneys who drafted the reversion clause, the documentation trail on Ethan's Delaware LLC." A pause. "How long has this been assembled?" 8 months, she said. Another pause. "Longer." "The reversion clause has been in the trust since before your marriage," he said. "That part's straightforward. But the forensic analysis of the transfers, the LLC documentation—" 8 months, she said again. "From when I found the first transfer, I called my father, I called our trust attorneys, and we assembled everything through proper legal channels. Every document that was submitted today is legitimate, Daniel, every piece of it." "I know," he said quickly. "That's not the question. The question is—" He stopped, started again. "You sat through those proceedings. You sat through his attorney characterizing you as financially irresponsible, financially negligent, financially dependent. You had documentation in hand that dismantled every one of those characterizations, and you sat there and let them make the argument." "Yes," she said. "Why?" She watched a group of people cross the plaza below where she and her father sat. A woman with a stroller, 2 men in suits walking fast, talking faster, a teenager with headphones who was completely elsewhere in his mind. "Because I needed him to go all the way," she said finally. If I'd shown the documentation during the proceedings, his attorney would have pivoted. He would have filed motions, requested delays, found procedural angles. The case would have stretched another 6 months. And at the end of it, Ethan would have had time to construct a different story. She paused. "I needed him to tell his full story without interruption in front of a judge. I needed every choice he'd made to be part of the public record before any of mine were." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "That's," he said, "a very specific strategy." "My father suggested it," she said. "Your father," Daniel said, and she could hear him recalibrating in real time, adjusting the mental image he'd been carrying of Richard Whitmore from whatever it had been before today to what it had revealed itself to be, is apparently a man with a very sophisticated understanding of how consequence actually works. "He's had some practice," she said. She ended the call. She sat with her father in the pale afternoon, and they were quiet for a while, the way people are quiet when a great deal has happened, and neither of them is in a hurry to fill it with words that aren't ready yet. Then her father said, "I made reservations. I thought you might need food that wasn't eaten at a desk." "I always need food that isn't eaten at a desk," she said. "I know," he said. "You ate at your desk for the last 3 years of your marriage. Your assistant told me." She turned to look at him. "You talked to my assistant." "I talked to a number of people," he said with perfect equanimity. She did not know whether to laugh or be mildly alarmed. She chose to let it go. They walked together down the courthouse steps, and the afternoon carried on around them, indifferent and ordinary, the way afternoons do, even after the moments that change the shape of everything. Across town in a corner office on the 31st floor of a building that faced the park, a phone was ringing that Ethan Caldwell was not yet answering. He would have to answer it eventually. That was the nature of consequences. They were patient in a way that people who create them rarely are. The phone kept ringing. Ethan sat in his car in the parking structure beneath the courthouse and stared at the concrete pillar in front of him and did not move for 11 minutes. He counted them because his watch was in front of him and he had nothing else to focus on. 11 minutes. In 11 minutes, his entire plan, the plan he had spent 18 months constructing the plan, he had trusted with the absolute confidence of someone who had never been seriously wrong about anything they'd decided had stopped being a plan and started being evidence. He called Victoria. It rang 4 times. She didn't pick up. He called again. Voicemail. He put the phone down on the passenger seat. He picked it up. He stared at the screen. Victoria Lane was 29 years old, and she had told him in the early weeks of their arrangement that she loved how decisive he was, how certain. She loved that he always knew what he was doing and where he was going. She had curled against his side in the apartment he'd rented, under a name connected to the Delaware LLC, and told him that she'd never felt so safe with anyone. He called a third time. The call went immediately to voicemail now. She had declined it. He sat with that for a moment, and it was not a comfortable moment. It was the specific discomfort of a person who has made an enormous wager and is watching the odds shift in real time, and who is beginning to understand that the wager was never quite what they thought it was. His work phone buzzed. He looked at it. The caller ID read, Gerald Merritt, Managing Director. Gerald Merritt was his boss. Gerald Merritt did not call on personal lines at 4 in the afternoon. Ethan pressed the phone face down on the seat next to the first one and started the car. He needed to go somewhere that wasn't this parking structure. He needed to go somewhere that wasn't his office. He needed to go somewhere that was preferably quiet, and where no one would ask him questions for at least 24 hours while he figured out what the next version of the plan looked like. He pulled out of the parking structure and into traffic. Behind him in the building, he'd just left a court clerk, was already processing the forensic documentation submitted by Richard Whitmore's legal team. 2 copies were being prepared, one for the presiding judge's chambers and one for the regulatory referral that Judge Sweeney had initiated. The copy for the regulatory referral was already in a separate envelope. It had an address on it. Ethan did not know about the envelope. He did not know about the address. He was driving through midtown traffic thinking about salvage, what could be restructured, what could be reframed, what explanation could be constructed that would allow him to stand in Gerald Merritt's office next week and tell a story that sounded different from the one that had just been told in a courtroom. He was very good at constructing stories. He had been doing it for years. The problem he had not yet had the stillness to fully confront was that he had been constructing stories for an audience that did not have access to the original documents. And the original documents were now in a court clerk's hands on their way to a regulatory body and attached to the name of a man whose name meant something that could not be reframed. Richard Whitmore. Ethan said the name in the car alone, just to hear what it sounded like out loud. He had heard that name. Everyone in finance had heard that name. Whitmore Capital Group was, he tried to calculate, and found that his mind was not working at its usual speed, that everything felt slightly submerged. It was one of the largest privately held investment groups in the country. It operated across 6 sectors. It had offices in 4 cities. It was the kind of entity that other financial institutions watched carefully, not because it was the loudest voice in the room, but because it was almost always the most consequential one. He had married the daughter of the man who ran it. He had not known. The sheer fact of not knowing sat in the car with him like a third passenger. I thought about the first year of their marriage, the conversations, the moments when Claire had tried to tell him things about her family, about her background, and he had listened with the surface of his attention while the deeper layers were already elsewhere, already planning, already calculating, already building toward the next version of himself that required her to be a certain kind of person. She had told him. She had told him her family had money. He had filed it under not particularly interesting and moved on. He had been so focused on the story he was building that he had failed completely to pay attention to the story she was already living. His work phone buzzed again. Gerald Merritt, again. This time Ethan picked up. "Gerald," he said, and his voice came out steadier than he'd expected, which was either professional muscle memory or a dissociation from reality that he'd evaluate later. "Ethan!" Gerald's voice had a quality to it that Ethan recognized from 2 years of working under him, the specific flatness of a man who has received information he did not want and is now managing the next steps with controlled efficiency. "I've been made aware of some developments from this afternoon." The speed of it. The information had moved faster than he'd driven. "The divorce proceedings," Ethan said. Not a question because there was no point. "Among other things," Gerald said, "I've spoken with legal. We're going to need you to come in tomorrow morning. Early." A pause. "Bring personal counsel. I'd strongly recommend someone with experience in regulatory compliance." Ethan watched the traffic light in front of him turn red. "Gerald, I can explain the tea tomorrow morning," Gerald said with a firmness that closed every door in the sentence. 8 o'clock. Bring counsel." The call ended. Ethan sat at the red light. The light turned green. He didn't move. The car behind him honked. He moved. He drove. I thought about the Delaware LLC. He thought about the accounts. He thought about the particular argument he had rehearsed for this exact scenario, the explanation that made the transfers look like legitimate asset management, that made the LLC look like standard financial planning, that made everything look like the careful behavior of a man managing his financial future, rather than what it actually was. The argument had always depended on one thing. It had depended on the other party not having documentation. He pulled over on a side street and sat very still and tried to think clearly, and the harder he tried, the more clearly he understood the shape of what had happened. Not the emotional shape, he wasn't ready for that yet. The structural shape, the architecture of it. Claire had known about the transfers for 8 months. She had said nothing. She had let him continue. She had let him build his case. She had let him walk into that courtroom with his charcoal suit and his confident attorney and his narrative of her irresponsibility. And she had sat across from him and listened to the entire thing and said nothing. Because she was waiting for him to go all the way. He understood that now. He had been given every opportunity to stop, to turn back, to make different choices, and he had not stopped because he was so certain he was winning that the possibility of turning back had never seemed relevant. He had laughed. In the courtroom, out loud. He pressed his hand over his eyes. The man who had been sitting in the back row, Richard Whitmore, founder and chairman of Whitmore Capital Group, had watched him do that, had watched him stand up before the judge left the bench, had watched him say finally free, had watched him turn toward Victoria like she was a prize, and had stood up quietly and with the patience of someone who has already arranged everything necessary, had simply said, "Are you sure you understand what you just won?" Ethan sat on that side street for a long time. His work phone buzzed again. He looked at it. Not Gerald this time, his assistant with a message flagged urgent. He looked at the message, looked away, looked back. There were 3 partners at his firm who had co-signed on account structures adjacent to the Delaware LLC, not because they'd known what he was doing, but because the account structures had been arranged through standard channels, and the connections were lateral rather than direct. The forensic analysis would find those connections. The regulatory review would map them. And those 3 partners, none of whom had done anything intentional, were now going to spend the next 6 months explaining their signatures to people who were paid to be skeptical. They would be angry. They would be very, very angry, and they would be looking for someone to be angry at. Ethan had an extremely clear sense of who that someone was going to be. He finally called his personal attorney, not Marcus Vane. Marcus Vane handled family law and had made it fairly evident this afternoon that their professional relationship had reached its natural conclusion. He called a different attorney, a man named Howard Cass, who had an office in Midtown and a reputation for handling situations that had become complicated through a combination of ambition and imprecision. Howard picked up on the second ring. "I need to see you today," Ethan said. "I'm in meetings until 6, Howard said. "After 6 then. Tonight. It's urgent." A pause on Howard's end, the professional assessment of urgency calibrating, whether this was the kind of urgent that could wait and the kind that couldn't. "Come at 6:30, Howard said. "Tell me generally what we're dealing with." Ethan told him. Not everything. The relevant shape of it. The courtroom, the documentation, the regulatory referral, the work phone call from Gerald. When he finished, Howard was quiet for a moment. "The Whitmore Family Trust," he said. "The documentation, was any of it fabricated?" "No," Ethan said. "You're certain?" "Yes." Another pause. "The transfers to the Delaware LLC, were they conducted through your employer's accounts?" Ethan closed his eyes. There were some adjacencies. Howard exhaled slowly through his nose. The sound was not reassuring. 6:30, he said. "Don't talk to anyone before then. Don't answer any calls from your employer. Don't respond to anything in writing." "Gerald already called," Ethan said. "He wants me in tomorrow at 8. "Call Gerald's assistant in the morning," Howard said, "and tell them you'll be rescheduling. I'll contact their legal team directly." "He said to bring personal counsel." "Good. Bring me." Howard paused. "Ethan, how deep does this go?" Ethan stared out the window of his car. "I thought about 4 years of careful construction, about the accounts arranged in layers, about the amounts accumulated slowly in figures designed to stay beneath automatic scrutiny, about the apartment that was no longer his, the investment portfolio that was now under review, the woman he had spent 18 months planning to leave and had apparently never understood at all." "Deep enough," he said. Howard said nothing. "I'll see you at 6:30, Ethan said and ended the call. He sat in his car on the side street in the middle of the city, and he thought for the first time with actual clarity, without the protective layer of his plan, between him and the question about Claire. Not about what she'd done, not about the documentation or the trust or the strategy, about Claire herself, the person, the woman who had sat across from him in that courtroom and listened to his attorney dismantle her character in front of a judge and had not flinched, had not cried, had not made a single move that was about getting back at him or hurting him or winning in the way he understood winning. She had simply sat there and waited and let him be exactly who he was choosing to be in full view of everyone who needed to see it. I thought about the morning 2 years ago when he had first started making the transfers. He had been in the kitchen early before she was awake. He had opened the laptop on the counter and initiated the first transfer, a small amount, a test amount, something that would read as an ordinary expense. If anyone looked, and he had stood in that kitchen in the house they shared and done it without hesitation. She had come downstairs 20 minutes later, still half asleep in the gray cardigan she'd had since before they were married, that he had complained about no fewer than 3 times because it was worn at the elbows. She had made coffee. She had sat down across from him. She had put her hand over his on the table and asked if he was tired because he'd looked tired lately, and was everything okay. He had said yes, everything was fine. He was just dealing with some work stress. She had nodded and squeezed his hand and gotten up to refill his coffee. He had watched her do it and felt nothing except relief that she hadn't looked at his screen. He sat in his car and thought about that morning and felt something move through him that was not guilt exactly. Guilt had architecture guilt pointed toward specific acts, but was something adjacent, something rawer, something that did not have a clean name, but lived in the space where you understand for the first time the actual weight of what a choice costs. Not to you, to the person who trusted you. He thought about Richard Whitmore sitting in the back row of the courtroom, not intervening, not signaling Claire, just watching, just recording with the particular attention of someone who has made enough consequential observations in his life to understand exactly what he was seeing. He thought about his own laugh. He had laughed. He had laughed in a courtroom after a divorce in which he had spent months systematically dismantling the financial life of the woman he had promised to be faithful to, and he had done it while standing in front of a judge in public before the proceedings had even formally concluded. He pressed his forehead briefly to the steering wheel. Not in grief. Not yet. He didn't have the full access to grief that the moment would eventually require. In something closer to the first shock of recognition. The recognition that a person who has been performing a version of themselves for so long that they've stopped noticing it as performing, that person sometimes needs a very specific kind of mirror. He had been handed his mirror this afternoon, and it was not what he'd expected to see. His personal phone buzzed. He looked at it. Unknown number. He almost ignored it. Then something made him pick up. "Is this Ethan Caldwell?" The voice was professional neutral, the voice of someone accustomed to delivering information without coloring it. "Yes," he said. "This is Patricia Webb from the Securities and Exchange Commission's New York Regional Office. We've received a regulatory referral this afternoon that includes your name and documentation related to account management in your role at—" He stopped listening, not because the voice stopped. It continued clear and measured, telling him things he needed to hear in a tone that was entirely without malice, because malice would have been unprofessional, and this was a professional call. He stopped listening because the name of the regulatory body had landed in his chest and detonated something quietly, and the detonation required a moment. The Securities and Exchange Commission. The regulatory referral had moved faster than Gerald's phone call, which meant the documentation that Richard Whitmore had submitted to the court this afternoon had been prepared in sufficient detail that the SEC had been able to act on it within hours, which meant that whoever had assembled that documentation had not done so casually. "Mr. Caldwell," the voice said. "Are you there?" "Yes," he said. "I'm here. We'll need you to present for an interview. Our office will be in touch with the details. Do you have legal representation?" "I'm in the process of arranging it," he said. "Very good. Please have your counsel contact our office by end of business tomorrow." A pause. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Caldwell." The call ended. Ethan sat with the dead phone in his hand and understood finally and completely what the older man's question had meant. "Are you sure you understand what you just won?" He had won nothing. He had walked into that courtroom carrying 18 months of planning and a charcoal suit and an attorney who didn't have all the information, and he had performed his victory in front of the one person whose entire purpose in being there was to record every detail of exactly that performance. He had not won a divorce, he had delivered a confession. And now the world that had been rearranged by his choices was settling into its new shape, and he was sitting in a car on a side street with 2 phones and no strategy that was still intact and an attorney he needed to see in 3 hours. He started the car. He drove. And behind him, Claire Whitmore sat in a restaurant with her father, and she ate food that wasn't eaten at a desk, and she answered none of the questions her father didn't ask, and she asked none of the questions she didn't yet have answers for, and they sat in the ordinary warmth of 2 people who have come through something significant together and are simply for a moment grateful to be on the other side of it. Her father ordered dessert. She hadn't seen him order dessert in years. "You're in a good mood," she said. "I'm relieved," he said simply. She looked at him. "You were worried." "I'm always worried," he said. "I'm your father. It comes with the territory." He picked up his fork. "I was specifically worried that you were going to flinch, that when his attorney started making those arguments, you were going to intervene earlier than the plan called for." "I thought about it," she admitted. "I know." "When he presented the first set of transfer documents and framed them as mine," she said, "that was the hardest moment, because I could see Daniel's face and I knew he was thinking he was losing and I wanted to—" She stopped. "Fix it," her father said. "Yes." "You didn't." "No." He nodded slowly. "That's the discipline that matters, Claire. Not the preparation, not the documentation. The discipline of staying still when everything in you wants to move." He looked at her. "It's the hardest thing I know how to do, and you did it better today than I've ever managed." She looked at her plate. "He laughed," she said, quietly, not with bitterness, just saying the fact of it. "Yes," her father said. "I didn't expect it to feel the way it felt." Her father set down his fork. He looked at her with full attention. "What did it feel like?" She was quiet for a moment, sorting through the layers of it. The immediate sensation, the thing underneath it, the thing underneath that. "Like the last piece of something finally falling into place," she said. "Not a good piece, not a piece I wanted, but the last one." She met her father's eyes. "Like the picture was finally complete, and I could stop waiting to see what it was." Richard Whitmore looked at his daughter for a long moment. "That's exactly right," he said. "That's exactly what it was." They sat there in the warmth of the restaurant and outside the city, moved in its endless and different rhythm, and Claire Whitmore ate her meal and did not check her phone and did not think about tomorrow yet, because tomorrow was tomorrow, and this evening was something that needed to be fully inhabited before it was over. She had been waiting a long time to simply be present in her own life. She intended to start tonight. The call came at 7:43 in the morning, 3 days after the courtroom. Claire was at her father's townhouse, not hiding, not retreating, but recalibrating the way you do after a significant event when you need ground beneath your feet that isn't still shaking. She was on her second cup of coffee, sitting at the kitchen table with a legal pad full of notes from her conversation with Daniel the previous evening, when her phone lit up with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. She picked up on the 4th ring. "Mrs. Caldwell." The voice was female measured and carried the particular efficiency of someone who made a great many calls in a day and had learned to compress courtesy without eliminating it. "My name is Susan Park. I'm a senior investigator with the SEC's New York Regional Enforcement Division. I apologize for the early hour. Do you have a few minutes?" Claire set down her coffee. "Yes. We've initiated a preliminary review of the documentation submitted to the court 3 days ago in relation to your divorce proceedings. As part of that review, we'd like to schedule an interview with you at your earliest convenience. You're not a subject of the investigation, I want to be clear about that. You're a potential witness with relevant financial knowledge." "I understand," Claire said. "We're also reaching out to your father's legal team today. The forensic accounting documentation your father submitted is quite thorough." A brief pause that carried something in it, professional admiration possibly, or the careful restraint of a person who has opinions they're not paid to share in this context. "We have some additional questions about the methodology and sourcing." "I'll have my attorney contact your office this morning," Claire said. "That would be appreciated. One more thing, Mrs. Caldwell, and again, I want to be clear. This is contextual, not evidentiary. Were you aware of the Delaware LLC prior to the divorce proceedings? The kitchen was very quiet. I became aware of it 8 months ago, Claire said, when I found the first anomalous transfer in our joint account records. And you retained forensic accounting support at that time. Through my family's legal team, yes. Another pause, longer. Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell. We'll be in touch through your attorney. The call ended. Claire sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she set it down, picked up her coffee, and wrote a single line on the legal pad. Call Daniel, SEC interview request. Her father appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was already dressed. He had been up since 5:30, which was not unusual for him. He looked at her expression and at the legal pad. The SEC, he said. Susan Park, senior investigator. They want an interview. She looked at him. They said the forensic documentation was thorough. It is thorough, he said with the mild satisfaction of someone commenting on craftsmanship. He moved to the coffee maker. Howard Cass called my attorney last night, by the way. She looked up. Ethan's new attorney. The same. He poured his coffee. He was attempting to understand the scope of the trust documentation. Specifically, he wanted to know whether the reversion clause could be challenged on the grounds of inadequate disclosure at the time of the marriage. Claire set down her cup. Can it? Our trust attorneys drafted that clause 22 years ago when the trust was established, her father said. It predates your marriage by nearly a decade and a half. It was disclosed in the trust summary provided to your joint financial advisored accounts. He paused. Ethan signed a document acknowledging receipt of that summary. She stared at him. He signed it. He signed it, her father confirmed. 4 pages in there was a paragraph describing the trust structure and its conditions. He signed the acknowledgement page. His signature is dated witnessed and on file. He sat down across from her. Howard Cass had a very short conversation with our attorneys. Claire absorbed this. She thought about Ethan, about the version of Ethan who would sign a 4-page financial disclosure document without reading it because he had categorized her family as not particularly interesting, and therefore any documentation associated with them as not worth his full attention. He signed the disclosure, she said half to herself. The irony, her father said without irony in his voice at all, is that if he had read it, he would have known. He would have known from the beginning exactly what the trust was, what it protected, and what would trigger its reversion clause. He would have had 6 years of that knowledge. He paused. And I often wonder what he would have done with it. He would have stayed, Claire said quietly, but for the wrong reasons. Yes, her father said, which is why you didn't tell him, and which is why I didn't tell him. The whole point was that he needed to make his choices without knowing. And he did, she said. And he did. Her father agreed. They sat with that for a moment, the strange, heavy completeness of a thing that played out exactly as feared, every choice confirming every concern, nothing saved by a last-minute reversal of character. Daniel's office opens at 8:30, she said, and picked up the legal pad. She was not a woman who sat still in the middle of motion for longer than necessary. There was work to do. There had always been work to do. The difference now was that the work was finally hers. Across town, the work being done was of a considerably less organized nature. Ethan had been in Howard Cass's office for 6 hours the previous day and had emerged with a legal strategy that Howard described as viable, and that Ethan understood in the honest part of himself that was becoming harder to avoid meant we have options, but none of them are good. Howard was a realist. Ethan had hired him specifically because Marcus Vane was not, and the difference between a lawyer who manages your expectations and one who tells you what you want to hear had become suddenly vastly important. The meeting with Gerald Merritt had been postponed once through Howard's intervention, but it could not be postponed indefinitely. Gerald was not a man who waited. He had built his position over 30 years by making decisions faster than other people were comfortable with, and the decision he was now in the process of making about Ethan Caldwell was not one he intended to delay for the convenience of the subject of it. Ethan knew this. He had worked under Gerald long enough to understand how his mind operated. He also understood with the clarity that comes from having your personal life forensically documented and submitted to a federal regulatory body that the call from the SEC had reached Gerald before Ethan had managed to reach Gerald himself, which meant Gerald had spent a day and a half with information that Ethan had not yet been able to contextualize, frame, or explain. Gerald had spent a day and a half alone with that information. That was catastrophic. Howard had coached Ethan extensively on what to say, and more critically what not to say when he finally sat down across from Gerald and the firm's legal team. Ethan had listened carefully. He was good at absorbing strategy. He could process information under pressure and deliver it in the register that a given situation required. He had been doing it his entire career. The problem was that this particular situation had a characteristic he wasn't fully prepared for. He couldn't construct a narrative for it. Every other difficult professional moment in his career had been navigable because he had been able to find the angle, the framing that made the difficult thing look like a calculated risk or a misunderstood decision or a circumstance beyond his control. He had always been able to locate the frame and step inside it. There was no frame for what the forensic documentation showed. The transfers were documented. The LLC was documented. The timeline was documented. The amounts, the accounts, the routing structures, all of it assembled with the painstaking thoroughness of people who had had 8 months and significant resources and the motivation of genuine personal injury to work with. You could not reframe documentation. You could only explain it. And explaining it required a version of the truth that Howard kept gently steering him away from, because the version of the truth that made Ethan feel better about his choices was not the version that would help him legally, and Howard had been very clear that his job was the second thing, not the first. His phone rang. He looked at it. Gerald Merritt. Direct line this time, not through the assistant. He answered. "My office. Today. 2 o'clock. Gerald's voice was flat and total, the voice of a man who has crossed from patience into resolution. "No postponement. Your counsel is welcome, but you will be there." "I'll be there," Ethan said. The call ended. He looked at his watch. 4 hours. He called Howard. "Gerald just called," he said when Howard picked up. 2 o'clock. Direct call, no assistant. He said no postponement. "All right." Howard's voice shifted into its professional efficiency, the mode that Ethan had come to recognize as the man actually working rather than managing. "I'll meet you in the lobby of your building at 1:30. I need you to listen to me very carefully between now and then. Are you somewhere you can concentrate?" "Yes," Ethan said. "The most important thing that's going to happen in that room today is not what you say, it's what Gerald says. I need you to let him talk. I need you to let him finish every sentence, every thought, every implication. You are not going to fill silences. You are not going to preemptively explain. You are going to listen, and then I am going to respond, and you are going to reinforce what I say. Can you do that?" Ethan was quiet. Listening without filling the space was not a natural behavior for him. His entire professional identity was built on the projection of certainty, and certainty did not wait for other people to finish talking. "I can do that," he said. "Good." Howard paused. "One more thing. Victoria Lane. Is there any professional overlap between her and your firm? Any context in which her name appears in work communications?" The question landed with specific weight. Ethan sat with it for 3 seconds too long. "Ethan," Howard said. "She interviewed for a position at the firm 14 months ago," Ethan said. "She didn't get the role." "Did you have any involvement in the interview process?" "I was on the evaluation panel," Ethan said. The silence on Howard's end lasted long enough to be a full response. "Who else knows that?" Howard said finally. "The other panel members, HR, whoever processed the documentation." A pause. "Gerald would have signed off on the final panel composition." "So Gerald knows you were on the panel that evaluated a candidate you were personally involved with." "He didn't know about the personal involvement at the time," Ethan said. "As far as I know." "As far as you know," Howard repeated, and the phrase carried the weight of someone who has learned through decades of practice that "as far as I know" is one of the most expensive phrases in the English language. "All right, we'll address it directly in the room if it comes up. Do not be the one to introduce it. 1:30 lobby, do not fill the silence." Ethan put the phone down. He thought about Victoria's declined calls. He thought about the 4 texts he'd sent in the 3 days since the courtroom, none of which had received a response. He thought about her voice in the early weeks of their arrangement, telling him she'd never felt so safe with anyone. He thought about the way she had been standing near the courthouse doors, ready to celebrate, and the way she had simply been gone by the time Richard Whitmore finished speaking. She had loved the lifestyle. He understood that now, with a completeness he hadn't been capable of 8 months ago or 6 months ago or even the morning of the courtroom. He understood it the way you understand something, when the evidence is not theoretical but actual, when you have called 4 times and been declined and texted 4 times and been left on read, and the lifestyle is no longer something you can offer. He understood it. And he was surprised, sitting in the quiet of his living room, the apartment he'd rented under the LLC name the one Claire had never seen, surprised at how much it didn't hurt in the way he'd expected it to. There was something there, a specific sting of rejection, but underneath it was something larger and less specific, something that didn't have Victoria's name on it, but had accumulated during the 3 days since the courtroom, growing quietly in the hours when he wasn't focused on strategy or calls or logistics, something that did have Claire's name on it. He pressed it back down. He needed to be functional for 2 o'clock. He pressed it back down and focused on the things he could still manage. Gerald Merritt's office was on the 41st floor. Ethan had been in it hundreds of times. He knew the particular quality of the light at 2 in the afternoon, and the way Gerald arranged himself behind his desk when he was in a conversation. He'd already decided the conclusion of leaning slightly forward, hands flat on the surface, the posture of someone who is offering you the courtesy of explaining a decision rather than the reality of negotiating it. Gerald was in that posture when Ethan and Howard walked in. 2 members of the firm's legal team were seated to the left. They had a folder on the table. Ethan recognized one of them, Carolyn Fitch, the firm's head of compliance, who had the particular expression of someone doing a job she found professionally significant and personally unfortunate. "Ethan," Gerald said. Not a greeting exactly, more like the opening move of something that had been arranged before they walked in the room. "Gerald." Ethan sat. Howard sat beside him. "Your counsel," Gerald said, acknowledging Howard with a nod that was professionally courteous and nothing more. He looked at Ethan directly. "I'm going to be straightforward. I think you know me well enough to know that's what you're going to get in this room." "I'd expect nothing else," Ethan said. "The SEC referral from Judge Sweeney's court has been received by our compliance office. The documentation included the forensic accounting, the account routing analysis. The LLC ownership structure has been reviewed by Carolyn's team." He nodded toward Carolyn Fitch. "Carolyn." Carolyn opened the folder. She did not look at Ethan with hostility. She looked at him with the professional neutrality of someone delivering findings, which was in some ways worse. 3 of the accounts used in the transfer routing structure have co-signatory access by partners of this firm, she said. The access was granted through standard operational channels, and those partners had no knowledge of how the accounts were being used. The access itself was not improper. She paused. The use was. "I need to understand," Gerald said, taking the conversation back, "how those accounts were included in a personal financial structure that you were operating outside of your employment relationship with this firm. I need to understand that clearly, and I need to understand it today because we have 3 partners who are currently being contacted by the SEC about their signatures on accounts they didn't know were being misused, and they are..." He paused with the restraint of a man choosing precise language over accurate language. "They have significant concerns." Howard cleared his throat. "Gerald, with respect, Ethan isn't in a position to discuss the specifics of account usage while the SEC review is active. We can speak to the general." "Howard," Gerald said, and his voice was still flat, still total, the voice that ended other voices. "I'm not asking for the court record. I'm asking Ethan in this room how 3 of my partners ended up associated with his personal financial activities." The room held its breath. Ethan remembered Howard's instructions. Do not fill the silence. Let Gerald finish. Do not preemptively explain. He looked at Gerald. He said nothing. Gerald looked back at him for a long moment. Then Gerald did something Ethan had never seen him do in 2 years of working for him. He leaned back. He picked up a pen. He set it down. He said, "I've been in this business for 30 years. I've watched people make decisions that cost them. I've seen ambition go sideways in every direction it can go sideways. I've given people the benefit of the doubt more times than I could count, including people who turned out not to deserve it." He paused. "I hired you because you were good. You were genuinely good. You were the best analyst I'd seen come through in 5 years, and I moved you up faster than anyone in your cohort because you earned it." He stopped. "What I'm looking at in this folder is not someone who made a mistake. It's someone who made a series of deliberate choices over 4 years using resources adjacent to this firm. And I need to understand whether those choices were, and I'm going to use this word carefully, contained." The word landed in the room with full weight. Contained. Meaning, is there more? Howard put a hand briefly on Ethan's arm, not visibly a light touch, the prearranged signal for, "Let me handle this." "Gerald," Howard said, "my client is cooperating fully with the SEC review process. Any determination of scope will be made through that process with full transparency. What I can tell you is that my client's activities were not sanctioned by or conducted on behalf of this firm, and we will be providing documentation to that effect." Gerald looked at Howard, then back at Ethan, then at his hands. "I'm going to tell you what's going to happen," Gerald said, "because I think you deserve to hear it directly from me rather than through correspondence." He sat forward again. "As of the close of business today, your access to firm systems and accounts is suspended pending the outcome of the SEC review. Your employment status is officially on administrative hold. If the review clears you of wrongdoing involving firm assets, we'll have a different conversation." He paused. "If it doesn't, we won't." Ethan sat very still. "Administrative hold. The careful, professionally appropriate language for you are effectively terminated, and the paperwork will reflect whatever the investigation determines." "I appreciate your directness," Howard said. Gerald was still looking at Ethan, not at Howard. "The three partners," Gerald said. "Wilson, Marsh, Davis, and Fong. They didn't know. I want that on the record in this room." "Understood," Ethan said. His voice came out steady. He was not sure how. "You're good at this," Gerald said, and it was not a compliment, or it was a compliment that had curdled into something else, something that recognized genuine capability and was made angry rather than proud by the context in which it was being displayed. "You're good at keeping your voice steady when everything is on fire. I used to think that was a professional asset." He stood. "I'll let Carolyn walk you through the access suspension process." He walked out of his own office, which was the clearest possible signal that the conversation, and a great many other things, was over. Howard leaned close to Ethan's ear while Carolyn Fitch began the suspension protocol with the care of someone diffusing something that might still go badly. "You held," Howard said quietly. "That was the right call. Don't speak to Wilson, Marsh, Davis, or Fong under any circumstances. If they contact you directly, route everything to me." "Wilson called me twice this morning," Ethan said. "Do not return that call," Howard said. "Forward me the number. I'll handle it." Ethan turned in his keycard and his access badges with the particular unreality of a person performing a familiar action in an entirely unfamiliar context. He had walked through the turnstile of this building's lobby hundreds of times. He had never before handed his keycard to a security officer while a compliance attorney documented the transfer. He rode the elevator down. He walked through the lobby. He stepped out onto the street, and for the first time since he had driven away from the courthouse parking structure, he had nowhere specific to go. Meanwhile, in Daniel Marsh's office on the other side of the city, Claire was sitting across from her attorney with the SEC's interview request in front of her, and a much clearer sense of direction than the man who had just handed in his keycard. "They want the interview next Wednesday," Daniel said. "I've spoken with Susan Park's office, the investigator who called you. They're focused on the LLC structure and the account routing. They want your account of when you first noticed the transfers and how you proceeded from that point." "That's straightforward," Claire said. "I have records of everything from 8 months ago forward." "I know you do." Daniel paused. "There's something else I want to raise with you. The trust reversion, the apartment. Now that the ruling is suspended and the court has accepted your father's documentation, there's a question of timeline. The reversion clause was triggered 8 months ago per your father's trust attorneys. Legally, the property has been under trust ownership for 8 months. The court's ruling attempted to award something that was at the point of ruling no longer in the marital estate." Claire looked at him. Which means the apartment question may resolve faster than the overall investigation. The trust attorneys can move on that independently of the SEC timeline." He looked at her over the top of his glasses. "You could be back in the apartment legally and clearly within 30 days. The apartment. She thought about it. The space she had chosen, the walls she had painted, the kitchen where she had made coffee in the early hours when Ethan was traveling, and she had the whole place to herself, and it had felt like a kind of freedom she hadn't had a name for yet. She thought about whether she wanted it. The answer surprised her with how clear it was. "No," she said. Daniel blinked. "No, I don't want the apartment," she said. "I want the trust to hold it. I want it off my personal balance sheet and back in the trust structure where it was always going to end up." She paused. "I'm not going back to that apartment." Claire, the value. I know the value, she said. I know exactly what it's worth. And I know that every morning I would wake up there. I would be waking up in a place where I spent 6 years not entirely seeing what was happening to me. She met his eyes. I'd rather have the clean version. Sell it through the trust. Use the proceeds for something that doesn't have that history. Daniel looked at her for a moment. Then he wrote something on his notepad. Understood, he said. I'll speak with the trust attorneys. There's something I want to discuss, Claire said. Something separate. Go ahead. The community business, the one I had before we were married, the financial literacy program. I closed it in the second year of the marriage because Ethan thought it was taking too much of my time and not generating meaningful return. She said this without inflection, just the fact of it. I want to reopen it, and I want to expand it. Daniel set his pen down. He was listening with full attention now. I want to create a program specifically for women coming out of financially complex divorces, she said. Women who don't understand the financial instruments their husbands were managing. Women who signed documents without knowing what they were signing. Women who have been told for years that the money side of things wasn't their concern. She paused. I signed 4 years' worth of joint account statements without questioning the management structure. I had a graduate degree and I was financially literate, and I still didn't look closely enough because I trusted the person managing those accounts. She stopped. There are a lot of women who trusted a person managing those accounts. Daniel was quiet. I want to build something real, she said. Not a non-profit that exists on paper, an actual organization with attorneys, financial advisors, and case advocates. Something funded properly, structured properly, and built to last. Your father's foundation, Daniel said carefully. Would that be a potential funding source? I've already spoken with him, she said. He said yes. He said to build it right, and he'd make sure it had what it needed. She held Daniel's eyes. I want to announce it within 60 days, before the SEC case is concluded, before people have moved on from this story. Daniel looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, not the professional patience or the careful management or the apologetic delivery of difficult information. Something more straightforward. He looked, she thought, genuinely moved. You want to make the announcement while people are still paying attention, he said. I want to make the announcement while women who are in the middle of what I was in the middle of are still paying attention, she corrected. He nodded slowly. I can help structure that. The legal entity, the funding arrangement, the public filing. He picked up his pen again. What are you going to call it? She had been thinking about this. She had been thinking about it since the night after the courtroom, lying awake in her father's guest room, sorting through the detritus of the past 6 years, and looking for the thing that was hers wholly and without question, the thing that had survived. The Clear Account Project, she said. Daniel wrote it down. It was the first time the name existed anywhere outside her own mind. It felt, she thought, like a beginning. She walked out of Daniel's office 40 minutes later into the afternoon, and the city moved around her with its ordinary indifference, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just letting the air hit her face. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Unknown number. She picked up. Claire. The voice was male, quiet. Not the official neutrality of the SEC, not the professional care of Daniel's office. Just a voice she knew stripped of everything except itself. Ethan. She stood very still on the sidewalk, surrounded by people moving in every direction, and she let the word, just her name, just one word in a voice she had known for 8 years, settle before she responded. Ethan, she said, I just left my building. A pause. They suspended my access. Gerald suspended my access. I know, she said. And she did know Daniel had been in contact with Gerald's office through separate channels. Nothing improper, just the ordinary flow of information in a legal case. I want to... He stopped, started again. I don't know what I want. I needed to hear your voice. Another pause, longer. That's an insane thing to say. I understand that. It's not insane, she said, and she meant it because she had loved this person for 7 years, and some version of that love, the original version, the version that predated the charcoal suit and the Delaware LLC and the laugh in the courtroom, was still something she could locate if she was honest about what she held. I'm not calling to ask for anything, he said. I want you to know that. I'm not calling to ask you to, I don't know, intervene, or explain anything, or change anything. A pause. I just wanted to say that I understand now what you said in the courtroom about not knowing, not being the same as not choosing. She listened. "I've been sitting with that for 3 days," he said. "Not knowing is not the same as not choosing, and I keep coming back to I made every single choice I made because I wanted to. Not because I was confused, not because I had incomplete information about the important things." He stopped. "I had incomplete information about your father's trust. I had complete information about who you were, and I chose the other things." The sidewalk flowed around her, and she stood in the middle of it. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry," he said. "I want you to know that. I know it doesn't change anything. I know it's not what you need from me, but I needed to say it." She thought about the question she had been asking for 6 years, the one her father had understood without being told: would Ethan love Claire if money was never part of the equation? She thought about the answer, which had been delivered in a charcoal suit in a courtroom, with a laugh that echoed. "Thank you," she said, "for saying it." "Are you—" He stopped. "I don't have the right to ask you how you are." "You can ask," she said. "Are you all right?" She stood on that sidewalk and felt the particular hard-won quality of a person who has survived something significant and is discovering with genuine surprise that they are more themselves on the other side of it than they were before. "I'm better than I've been in years," she said. The silence on his end lasted long enough that she thought he might not respond. "Good," he said finally. He cleared his throat. "Good. Take care of yourself, Ethan," she said. She ended the call. She put her phone in her pocket. She stood on the sidewalk for one more moment, just herself, just Claire Whitmore with the afternoon around her, and 60 days to an announcement and a name written on Daniel Marsh's notepad, and a father who had ordered dessert and said he was relieved. Then she turned and she walked, and she did not look back. Because the picture was complete now. She had seen it in full. She had held it for exactly as long as she needed to. And she was done holding things that weren't hers to carry anymore. The announcement went out on a Tuesday morning, 53 days after the courtroom. Claire had chosen Tuesday deliberately, not Monday, which carried the distracted energy of a week just beginning, and not Friday, which carried the distracted energy of a week just ending. Tuesday was a day when people were paying attention, when the news cycle had room, when a woman standing at a podium in a midtown conference room could say what she had to say, and the people who needed to hear it would have the bandwidth to actually receive it. She wore a dark blue dress she had bought for herself with her own account from a store she had chosen without consulting anyone. It was a small thing. It felt enormous. Daniel Marsh stood to her left. Her father stood to her right, though slightly behind his choice deliberate. Because Richard Whitmore had spent a lifetime understanding that the most powerful thing a person with his kind of weight could do in certain moments was stand behind someone else and let the room understand what that posture meant. There were 14 journalists in the room. 3 television cameras, a photographer from a financial publication that Claire had read for years and had never imagined being in. She looked at the room. The room looked at her. She began. 6 years ago, I signed a joint account disclosure document without reading it carefully, she said. I was educated. I was financially literate. I had graduate coursework in economics, and I understood investment structures, and I had at that point in my life reviewed more complex documents than the one sitting in front of me. She paused. I signed it because I trusted the person sitting across from me. I signed it because I believed that trust was the same as protection. Another pause. It is not, and I spent 6 years learning the difference. The room was very quiet. The Clear Account Project is a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing financial literacy education, legal advocacy, and case support to women navigating financially complex divorce proceedings. We exist because too many women have signed documents without reading them, accepted financial narratives without questioning them, and emerged from marriages they entered in good faith with nothing. Not because they were naive, but because the system that was supposed to protect them assumed they already had everything they needed. She looked up from her notes. They didn't. We do now, and we're going to share it. She spoke for 11 more minutes. She answered 7 questions. 2 of the journalists asked about the divorce. She answered both questions directly, without defensiveness and without drama. Yes, the proceedings had been the catalyst. Yes, her father's involvement had been significant. No, she did not consider what she was building to be about personal vindication. She considered it to be about the next woman who was sitting in a conference room signing a document she hadn't read, and the woman after that, and the one after that. One journalist, a young woman from a digital outlet who looked like she was 26 and had the eyes of someone who had already seen more than 26 years, should require, raised her hand and asked a question that wasn't on the prepared list. "Ms. Whitmore," she said, "you're building something significant here. You have the resources and the platform to make this organization genuinely impactful, but I'm curious about something more personal." She paused. "What do you want the women who come through this program to feel, not understand, not know, feel?" Claire looked at her. She thought about sitting in Daniel Marsh's office the week before the divorce proceedings began, watching him manage his expression as he explained that Ethan's documentation was coherent and damaging and that the case was going to be difficult. She thought about the specific quality of helplessness that is not actually helplessness but feels like it because the tools you need are in someone else's hands and they are not using them in your direction. "Ready," she said. "I want them to feel ready. Not after, before the next thing happens. Ready in advance with their eyes open, with their name on documents they actually understand." She held the young journalist's gaze. "Because the most powerful moment in my experience of the last year was not standing in a courtroom watching the truth come out. It was the moment 8 months before that when I sat down with my father's attorneys and understood exactly what I had, exactly what it meant, and exactly what I could do with it." She paused. That morning, that quiet, completely private morning, that was when everything changed. Not the courtroom, the morning. She looked around the room. "That's what this organization is going to give women, that morning, as early as possible, before they need it." The room was still. Then the young journalist nodded once very deliberately and wrote something in her notebook. Richard Whitmore, standing slightly behind his daughter, looked at the back of her head and felt something that he had been accumulating for 53 days since the courtroom and had not yet had the right moment to feel fully. He felt proud. Not in the reflexive, automatic way of a parent observing a child's success. In the specific, hard-won way of someone who has watched a person he loves go through something that could have broken them and has instead watched them emerge from it, clearer, stronger, and more fully themselves than they had ever been in his presence. He pressed his lips together. He did not make a sound. He stood behind her and let the room see what his presence meant. That was enough. That was more than enough. The press conference ended at 11:40. By noon, 3 outlets had published initial stories. By 2 o'clock, the story had been picked up by 2 national publications and a financial news network that ran a 4-minute segment with Claire's photograph and the words, "Whitmore Heiress Launches Divorce, Financial Advocacy Org" across the bottom of the screen. Claire watched the segment from Daniel's office sitting beside her father and said nothing for a moment after it ended. "They used the word heiress," she said. "They did," her father agreed. "I've never used that word for myself in my life." "I know." She considered it, the word and all its implications, the 6 years of deliberate distance from everything that word represented, the gray cardigans and the desk lunches, and the modest presentation she had maintained, not out of shame, but out of a genuine, carefully considered choice to be known for what she was rather than what she came from. "It's going to follow the story," she said. "Yes," her father said, "for a while, and then the story will be the organization, and then the organization will be the story, and the word will matter less because the work will matter more." He looked at her. "You know that." "I know that," she said. She picked up her phone. 14 messages, 3 from women she didn't know who had found her professional email through the press release, who had written things that she read with the specific full-body quality of attention that comes when you recognize something true. One of the messages was 3 sentences long. A woman in Ohio divorced 2 years ago who had emerged from the proceedings without the retirement account she had contributed to for 18 years because she had signed a waiver she hadn't understood. She did not ask for anything. She just said, "I wish this had existed 2 years ago. Thank you for building it." Claire read that message twice. She set the phone down. "We're going to need to move faster than 60 days for the first intake cohort," she said to Daniel. He looked up from his desk. "How fast?" 30 days, she said. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her since the courtroom, with the recalibrated attention of someone who has upgraded their assessment of a person and is still in the process of adjusting to the new version. "I'll make some calls," he said. Ethan Caldwell read the news segment story on his laptop in the rented apartment at 2:17 in the afternoon, 23 minutes after it published online. He read it once, then he read it again. He sat with the laptop open in front of him and did not move for a long time. The story was not about him. His name appeared twice in the context of the divorce proceedings as the inciting event of Claire's organizational work, and both times with the neutral factual register of a journalist reporting a public record rather than editorializing. He was not the subject of the piece. He was the circumstance. He had spent his career being the subject. He was now the circumstance. He closed the laptop. Howard Cass had called that morning with an update on the SEC review. The review was 3 weeks in and had expanded as Howard had carefully forecast to include a broader examination of account structures connected to the firm. 3 partners were actively cooperating with investigators. Gerald Merritt had submitted a voluntary disclosure package that Howard described as thorough, and that Ethan understood meant Gerald was cooperating fully and protecting the firm as his primary obligation, which was what Gerald would always do, because that was who Gerald was and had always been. The voluntary disclosure package included everything. Howard had been honest about what that meant. "The question isn't whether they have the information," he had said. "They have the information. The question is how you position yourself relative to it. Full cooperation from this point forward is the only viable strategy, not partial cooperation, not cooperation with retained ambiguity, full." Ethan had agreed. He was cooperating. He spent 4 hours on Monday at the SEC's offices on Vesey Street with Howard beside him, walking through 4 years of account activity in the particular detail that investigators require. Not the broad strokes, not the summary version, but the granular transaction-by-transaction, decision-by-decision account of how money had moved and why and when and to where. It was, he thought, the most honest he had been about anything in 4 years, possibly longer. The investigator assigned to his portion of the case was a man named Arthur Chen, who was approximately 50 and had the unhurried quality of someone who understood that thorough work done carefully produced better outcomes than fast work done impressively. He asked questions with the specific precision of someone who already had most of the answers and was documenting the ones he needed confirmed. At one point, Arthur Chen asked him without particular emphasis, "Mr. Caldwell, did you believe at the time that the transfer routing structure you established was compliant with your firm's conflict of interest policies?" Ethan looked at the question. Howard was watching him. "No," Ethan said. "I knew it was not." Arthur Chen wrote something. Howard said nothing. It was the most significant single answer Ethan had given in the entire session, and the room held it for a moment before Arthur Chen moved to the next question. Ethan drove home from that session and sat in the rented apartment and felt something he did not immediately have a name for. It was adjacent to exhaustion, but more specific. It was the particular quality of having told the complete truth about something after a long time of not telling it and finding that the truth was in its way lighter than the weight of its management. Not good exactly. The consequences were still the consequences, but lighter. He thought about Wilson calling him twice before Howard had told him not to return the call. He thought about Wilson's voice in the one voicemail he'd listened to before deleting the rest, not angry, which he'd expected, but bewildered. The specific bewilderment of a person who has been told they are adjacent to something they did not know existed and is trying to understand how that happened to them. I thought about sitting across from Wilson at firm events and dinners, and the particular ease of those interactions, the shared professional language, the mutual respect, the solid, ordinary colleagueness of it. He thought about Wilson's signature on a form that Wilson had signed because it was a routine thing to sign, not because Wilson had any reason to look more carefully. He thought about the number of people who had been in proximity to his choices without knowing it. The number was not small. There was a knock at his door. He looked up. Nobody knocked at this door. The building had a doorman. If someone was at his door, the doorman had sent them up, which meant it was someone whose presence the doorman had reason to authorize. He went to the door. He opened it. Victoria Lane was standing in the hallway. He stared at her. She was wearing what he would have described a year ago as the version of herself she deployed for specific situations, put together, precise, projecting an ease that was real enough to read as effortless and constructed enough to serve a purpose. "I've been trying to decide whether to come for a week," she said. "Can I come in?" He stepped back. She came in. She did not sit immediately. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at him with an expression he had not seen from her before. Not the confidence, not the ease, not the performance of ease. Something more uncertain, more real. "I declined your calls," she said. I know, he said. I want to explain that. Victoria, let me explain it, she said with a firmness that surprised him. You can tell me to leave after, but let me say what I came to say. He sat down. He gestured for her to sit. She did not. I declined your calls because I panicked, she said. When the man stood up in the courtroom, when I understood who he was, what it meant, I panicked. Not because I didn't care about what was happening to you, because I understood standing there that I had built my idea of what we were around things that were now. She stopped. I'm not explaining this well. You're explaining it fine, he said. I built it around the lifestyle, she said. The word came out like a confession. Not intentionally. I didn't sit down and calculate it. But when I'm honest, and I have been trying very hard to be honest since that courtroom because I think dishonesty is what got everyone in that room into trouble. When I'm honest, what I was attracted to was the version of you that came with everything attached. The apartment, the dinners, the way people deferred to you. She met his eyes. Not you. He looked at her. She looked back. I know, he said. Something shifted in her expression. She had come prepared for pushback, for argument, for the version of him that would defend himself, or minimize, or reframe. The immediate acknowledgement undid her slightly. You know, she said. I've had a lot of quiet time recently, he said. I've been thinking about how people actually saw me versus how I needed to be seen. He paused. I think I performed for you, and you responded to the performance, and neither of us was actually there. She was quiet for a moment. I want to ask you something, she said, and I want you to answer honestly. All right. Did you love her? She said it without drama, just the question. Claire, did you love her? I thought about the kitchen in the Park Avenue apartment, the gray cardigan with the worn elbows, the hand over his on the table. Are you tired? Is everything okay? Yes, he said, in the beginning, and in the middle in a way that I had stopped paying attention to, which is its own kind of answer. He looked at the wall. I think I loved her and decided she was ordinary at the same time, and the second decision killed the first one, and I didn't notice until the first one was already gone. Victoria sat down then, not near him on the chair opposite at a considered distance. I think I owe her an apology, she said. I know that's strange. I know I'm probably the last person she wants to hear from, but I was complicit in something that hurt someone. She looked at her hands. I want to at least acknowledge that to someone. I'll tell her, Ethan said. If you want, I can tell her. Victoria looked at him. You're still in contact with her. Once, he said. 3 days after, she answered. She's better than she's been in years. She said that. He paused. I believe her. Victoria was quiet. She's building something, he said. An organization. I read about it today. He looked at Victoria. She's turning everything that happened into something that helps people. That's what she's doing with it. He stopped. That's who she was the whole time. The whole time I was categorizing her as someone who wasn't keeping up with me. Victoria looked at him. What are you going to do, she said, after all of this, when it's done? He thought about it. It was the first time the question had been asked in those exact terms. Howard talked about outcomes and strategies and cooperation frameworks. Gerald had talked about containment. The SEC investigators talked about documentation and compliance. Nobody had asked him what he was going to do with himself on the other side of the thing he had built and watched collapse. I don't know yet, he said. He meant it. I did not know yet. He had spent so many years knowing where he was going, knowing how he was getting there, knowing what the next version of himself looked like. That not knowing had a quality he couldn't quite name. It was uncomfortable. It was also in some way he was still locating honest. That might be the most truthful thing I've heard you say, Victoria said. He looked at her. It might be, he agreed. She stood. She pulled her coat tighter. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was, he thought, close to sadness. Not grief, not regret, in the complicated personal sense, but the specific sadness of someone looking at a situation that could have been different if the people in it had been different, and understanding that the could have been is not and never will be the thing that actually happened. Take care of yourself, she said. I mean that. I know you do, he said. She left. He sat in the rented apartment, and outside the city was doing what it always did, moving, indifferent, enormous, full of the simultaneous lives of people, none of whom knew or cared what was happening in this particular room, and he sat with the quiet of it. He picked up his phone. He opened the news article about the Clear Account Project. He read it a third time. Then he read a fourth time the quote from the press conference, the one the article had pulled as its headline pull quote. The most powerful moment was not the courtroom. It was the quiet morning before when I understood exactly what I had. He read it. He set the phone down. He understood sitting there that Claire had built something out of the worst year of her life that would outlast every version of any story anyone might tell about what had happened between them. She had taken the raw material of betrayal and financial manipulation and a laugh in a courtroom and turned it into something that would still be helping people 10 years from now when the specifics of the divorce had faded from every news story and search result and public record. She had built something real. He had built a Delaware LLC. He did not wallow in the comparison. He simply sat with it the way he had been learning to sit with things that were true without immediately trying to reframe them. 3 floors below his doorman was receiving a courier delivery, a thick envelope from a legal firm addressed to Ethan Caldwell, marked as requiring signature. The envelope contained the formal notification of the SEC's preliminary findings, which Howard had told him to expect this week, and which contained specific language about cooperation, credit, and compliance remediation, and the particular kind of bureaucratic precision that means this is serious, and you have begun to address it seriously, and here is what comes next. The doorman sent it up. Ethan signed for it. He set it on the table without opening it immediately. He would open it. He would call Howard. He would read every word and understand every implication and proceed through every subsequent step with the cooperation that was the only viable strategy remaining to him. He would do all of that. But first he sat for a moment in the particular quiet of a person who has arrived through a path entirely of their own construction at the absolute bottom of the structure they built, and who is discovering with something that is not quite hope, but is something in that direction that the bottom is at least solid ground. You could not build on nothing, but you could build on solid ground. He did not know yet what he would build. He sat with not knowing, which was for a man who had spent 15 years fleeing it, an act of discipline that cost him more than anything else he had done in the last several weeks. The envelope sat on the table. The city moved outside the window. And in a conference room across town, Claire Whitmore was sitting across from the first 3 women who had applied to the Clear Account Project's inaugural intake cohort, women who had heard the press conference or read the articles or been forwarded a link by a friend or a sister or a therapist who had said quietly, "You should look at this," and she was listening to them tell her things that she recognized from the inside. One of them was a woman named Barbara, 61, from Connecticut, who had been married for 32 years and had come out of her divorce without access to the pension account she had contributed to for 28 of those years because her husband had restructured it through an LLC 18 months before he filed, and the documentation had been too complex for the attorney she could afford to untangle in the time available. Barbara told her this in a voice that was steady and careful and fully controlled in the way that voices are when their owners have practiced the telling until it no longer breaks them apart, but the effort of the practice is still visible underneath. Claire listened. She did not offer immediate solutions. She did not project reassurance. She listened with the full specific attention of someone who had been in a version of this room, not the same circumstances, but the same fundamental experience of holding information that you didn't know how to use in a system that wasn't designed to help you use it. When Barbara finished, she looked at Claire with an expression that was part wariness and part something more fragile. "Is it too late for me?" Barbara asked. "It's been 2 years. The settlement was finalized. I don't know if there's anything—" "Tell me the details of the pension restructuring," Claire said. "Specifically the LLC structure and the timeline. We have a financial forensics partnership with 2 firms that specialize in retroactive asset analysis." She held Barbara's eyes. "Finalized settlements can be reopened under specific circumstances. I'm not promising anything, but I want you to tell me the details." Barbara looked at her. Then she began to talk. And Claire listened, and the woman beside Barbara listened, and the intake coordinator took careful notes, and the Clear Account Project was no longer just a name on a notepad in Daniel Marsh's office. It was a room with women in it and a table and someone paying full attention. It was, Claire thought, precisely what she had been building toward. Not the courtroom, not the laugh, not the charcoal suit or the Delaware LLC or the name Richard Whitmore said in front of a judge. This room, this table, this woman telling her story for the first time to someone who already knew the shape of it. She would be here tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. That was the only answer that had ever mattered to her. She was finally in a position to give it. The SEC's formal findings arrived on a Thursday morning 4 months after the courtroom in a document that Howard Cass delivered to Ethan in person, rather than by courier, which told Ethan everything he needed to know about the weight of what was inside before he opened the first page. Howard sat across from him at the small table in the rented apartment and watched Ethan read with the patient attention of an attorney who has learned that the moment after a client reads significant legal documentation is not the moment for talking. Ethan read. He read the findings section. He read the remediation requirements. He read the civil penalty figure, which was substantial, and the cooperation credit notation, which reduced it from what it otherwise would have been, and the compliance bar notation, which meant that his ability to work in any registered financial capacity was suspended for a period that Howard had been preparing him for, but that still landed differently in print than it had in verbal forecast. He set the document down. 7 years, he said. 7 years from the date of the formal order, Howard said, with a review eligibility at the 5-year mark if the remediation benchmarks are met and there are no subsequent violations. 5 years before review eligibility. Yes. Ethan looked at the wall. I'm 35. I know. I'll be 40 before I can apply for review, 42 before any realistic reinstatement. That is the arithmetic, Howard said without softening it, because softening it would have been a disservice. And Howard Cass, whatever his limitations, did not do his clients the disservice of softening arithmetic. Ethan sat with that. He had known this was the likely outcome. Howard had walked him through the probability range 3 weeks ago, and the formal findings were within the range Howard had forecast, which meant Howard had been accurate, which meant Ethan had been given honest counsel and had no legitimate cause for surprise. He was still surprised, not at the findings, at himself, at the specific interior quality of sitting in a rented apartment at 35 years old, reading a federal regulatory document that suspended the career he had spent 15 years building and discovering that what he felt was not primarily devastation. It was something closer to relief. He turned that over carefully because relief was not the response he had expected, and he did not trust unexpected responses anymore. He had trusted his instincts too completely for too long, and the instincts had been in significant areas profoundly wrong, but the relief was real. It had been building since the session with Arthur Chen at the SEC offices, since the moment he had said out loud on the record, "I knew it was not compliant," and the room had held that truth, and the ceiling had not fallen. Since the moment of full cooperation, when the strategy had shifted from management to transparency, and the enormous effort of maintaining the managed version had simply stopped. He had been managing a story for 4 years. He was done managing it. The civil penalty, he said. Timeline. Installment structure is available. 18 months with the first payment due 60 days from the formal order. Howard paused. Your personal assets are sufficient to cover it. The LLC assets were frozen in the preliminary phase, but your personal accounts, the ones outside the LLC structure, were not part of the violation scope. Those remain accessible. And the firm, Ethan said, Wilson Marsh Davis Fong. The 3 partners have been cleared of direct involvement. Their cooperation with the review is noted in the findings. The firm itself received a compliance citation and a mandatory remediation program, no financial penalty. Howard looked at him directly. Gerald submitted a statement to the investigators, on your behalf. Ethan looked up. A statement, he said. A character statement, voluntary, unsolicited by the investigation. Howard picked up his own copy of the document and turned to a specific page. Paragraph 4 of the cooperation credit section references voluntary testimony from a senior industry colleague that confirmed the isolated nature of the violations and supported the finding that firm partners were not complicit. He set the document down. Gerald submitted it 2 weeks ago. Ethan stared at him. He had not known this. He had not spoken to Gerald since the day his keycard was collected. He had followed Howard's instruction to the letter, no direct contact, all communication through counsel. Gerald had submitted a statement in support of the cooperation credit finding without being asked, without notifying Ethan, and without, as far as Ethan could determine, any expectation of acknowledgement. Why? Ethan said. I asked Gerald's attorney the same question, Howard said. The response was, he paused, recalling it precisely, that Gerald had employed Ethan for 2 years, that the violations did not implicate the quality of Ethan's professional work during that employment, and that Gerald did not believe a man's worst choices should be the only evidence submitted about his character. Howard paused again. Those were the words. Ethan looked at the table. He thought about Gerald's posture in that meeting, leaning forward, hands flat, the posture of a decision already made. The way Gerald had said you were good, you were genuinely good, and the complicated anger that had lived inside the sentence. He thought about the keycard, the administrative hold language, the deliberate courtesy of being told directly rather than through correspondence. And then separately, in the same week that Ethan had been in the SEC offices answering Arthur Chen's questions with full transparency, Gerald had sat down and written a voluntary character statement, without being asked, without telling Ethan. He pressed his eyes closed for a moment. I need to write him a letter, he said. When the formal order is issued, yes, Howard said. I can review it before you send. Not a legal letter, Ethan said. A letter. Howard looked at him. All right, Howard said. They went through the remaining logistics of the document for another 40 minutes, the remediation benchmarks, the reporting requirements, the specific conditions of the compliance bar, and what it did and did not restrict. Howard answered every question with the precision Ethan had come to rely on and had in the early days of their working relationship undervalued because he had been so accustomed to attorneys who managed rather than explained. When Howard left, Ethan sat alone with the document. He did not immediately begin planning what came next. He had learned in the months since the courtroom to resist the instinct to immediately convert every new reality into a strategy. The strategy instinct was not bad in itself. It was the instinct that had made him genuinely good at his work that Gerald had recognized and promoted. But it had also been the instinct he had deployed in every area of his life without discrimination, including the areas where it had no business operating. You did not strategize your marriage. You did not strategize your character. He sat with the document and he thought about his father, which he had not done in a long time. His father, who had worked for 31 years at a manufacturing company in Ohio and had come home every evening smelling of the work and had sat at the kitchen table and asked Ethan about his day with genuine, undistracted attention. His father, who had never made more than $60,000 a year and had considered it sufficient because what he was building was not a financial empire, but a family, which required a different kind of investment and produced a different kind of return. Ethan had spent his entire adult life deciding his father's version was smaller than what he wanted. He sat there and wondered for the first time without defensiveness whether it had been. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. A number he didn't recognize. He almost ignored it. Then he answered because he had learned in the months since the courtroom that not answering things was how things became larger than they needed to be. Mr. Caldwell, male voice, calm professional with the particular warmth of someone who is accustomed to delivering messages on behalf of other people. My name is James Whitmore. I'm Richard Whitmore's personal assistant. Mr. Whitmore is requesting a meeting. At your convenience and with the full understanding that you are under no obligation of any kind. He asked me to be explicit about that. Ethan held very still. Richard Whitmore wants to meet with me, he said. Yes, sir. Why? He didn't specify the full reason, Mr. Caldwell. He said only that he had something he wanted to say directly, and that he believed you deserved to hear it in person, rather than through any other channel. Ethan thought about the courtroom, the gray jacket, the patience. Are you sure you understand what you just won, the measured, entirely unperformative quality of a man who had already arranged everything necessary and was simply waiting for the right moment to speak? Tell him yes, Ethan said. Shall I suggest a time? Whatever works for him, Ethan said. He put the phone down. He sat with the peculiar suspended quality of a person who has just agreed to a meeting that their earlier self would have approached with strategy and performance and the careful construction of an impression, and who is now approaching it with nothing except the decision to show up as himself and let whatever happened happen. It was, he thought, the most honest RSVP he had given in years. The meeting with Richard Whitmore took place 4 days later in a private dining room at a club in Midtown that Richard used for conversations he wanted to have without ambient noise. Ethan arrived early. Richard arrived at the exact appointed time, wearing a jacket that was different from the gray courthouse jacket, but carried the same quality of deliberate understatement. He did not make Ethan wait. He did not open with pleasantries that would have felt false given the context. He sat, he accepted coffee, and he looked at Ethan with the full specific attention that Ethan had seen him give to everything in the courtroom, and that he now understood was simply how Richard Whitmore operated, completely present, completely attentive, wasting nothing on performance. "I read the findings," Richard said. "I assumed you might," Ethan said. "Cooperation credit was applied appropriately." A pause. "The bar period is significant." "It is," Ethan said. "How are you managing the practical aspects?" It was not the question Ethan had expected. He had expected he wasn't sure what he had expected. Something with edges, something that established position. "Howard Cass has structured the remediation framework," Ethan said. "The penalty payment is arranged. The compliance monitoring is straightforward." He paused. "The practical aspects are manageable. The other parts are taking more work." Richard nodded slowly, like the answer was what he expected, and he was confirming receipt. "I want to tell you something," Richard said, "and I want to be clear that I'm not saying it for your benefit specifically. I'm saying it because I spent 40 years learning it, and I've learned that passing it to the right person at the right time is the only way it doesn't die with the person who figured it out." Ethan waited. "Money doesn't change people," Richard said. "I've watched people believe that their entire lives believe that wealth will make them more of whatever they want to be, more confident, more generous, more certain, more free." He wrapped his hands around the coffee cup. "It doesn't. It removes friction. And what you discover when friction is removed is exactly who you were when the friction was present, just more visible, just more available to be seen." Ethan looked at him. "You spent the duration of your marriage to my daughter building a version of yourself that required constant friction management," Richard said. "The LLC, the transfers, the narrative you constructed for the divorce, all of it was friction management. All of it was the effort required to maintain a version of yourself that was not what you actually were." "Yes," Ethan said. "That effort is gone now," Richard said. "The friction you were managing is public. The version is no longer available." He looked at Ethan directly. "What's left is the actual material, and what you do with the actual material is the only question that matters from this point forward." Ethan held the coffee cup and said nothing for a moment. "She built something," he said finally. "Claire built something real." "She did," Richard said. "I read about the first cohort," Ethan said. "The intake program, the woman from Connecticut, Barbara." He paused. "The article mentioned the pension case was reopened, that the forensic analysis found recoverable assets." "It did," Richard said, and something in his voice shifted not into softness exactly, but into the register of someone for whom a specific piece of information carries specific meaning. "Barbara will recover approximately 60% of the assets from the original pension structure. Not all, but 60% is not nothing." "No," Ethan said, "it's not nothing." They sat with that for a moment. "I want to ask you something," Ethan said, "and I recognize I may not have the standing to ask it." "Ask?" Richard said. "Is she—" He stopped. "Is she all right? Not the organization, not the strategy. Her. Is she actually all right?" Richard Whitmore looked at his daughter's ex-husband across the table with the unhurried attention of someone weighing not the question, but the person asking it. "She is better than she has been in years," he said. "She told you that herself." "I know. I believed her then. I still believe her." Ethan paused. "I just wanted to hear it from someone who sees her every day." "She is," Richard said. "She is genuinely well. She is working harder than she's ever worked and sleeping better than she has in 6 years and laughing more than I have seen her laugh in a long time." He paused. "She is Ethan, the full version of herself, the version she was always going to become when she had the room to become it." Ethan looked at the table. "I took up a lot of room," he said quietly. "Yes," Richard said. "You did." No comfort offered, no softening, just the fact delivered with the same patient precision as everything else. It was, Ethan thought, the kindest thing Richard Whitmore could have done, the kindest and the hardest, which were often the same thing. "I'm thinking about going back to Ohio," Ethan said. It was the first time he had said this out loud. He had been thinking it for 3 weeks, turning it over, testing its weight. My father is still there. He's in his mid-60s. He's healthy, but he's alone, and he's been alone since my mother died, and I have not been present for that in the way I should have been." Richard was quiet. "The bar period gives me time," Ethan said. "I can't practice. I can consult in limited capacities," Howard says. "But the full professional structure is paused." He paused himself. "I've been thinking about what you build in a pause." "What you build in a pause," Richard said, "depends entirely on what you start with." "I know," Ethan said. "I'm starting with a lot less than I came into this year with." "In some categories," Richard said. "In others, perhaps more." Ethan looked at him. He thought about Arthur Chen's office, about full cooperation, about the weight that had lifted when the managing stopped, about Gerald's voluntary statement and the shock of unearned generosity, and what it felt like to receive something you hadn't earned and hadn't manipulated and hadn't constructed something given simply because the person giving it had decided it was right. I thought about what it felt like to be on the receiving end of that, and he thought for a long, quiet moment about how rarely he had been the one giving it. "I'm going to write to Claire," he said. "Not a long letter. I don't have anything to say that she needs to hear. But I want her to know that I've read about the project, that I understand what she's building." He looked at Richard. "And I want her to know that if there is ever anything in whatever I have going forward that could be useful to that work, she can have it." Richard considered this. "I'll tell her you said so," he said. "You don't have to." "I know," Richard said. "I'll tell her because she should know, not because it changes anything, but because she should know." They finished their coffee. When they stood to leave, Richard extended his hand and Ethan shook it, and the handshake was nothing except what it was. Two people who had been on opposite sides of a significant event, acknowledging each other with basic human courtesy at the end of a conversation that had been honest. Nothing more, but not less. On the sidewalk outside, Richard Whitmore paused. "One more thing," he said. Ethan stopped. "You asked what money reveals," Richard said. "You didn't use those words, but that was the question underneath everything you said in there." He looked at Ethan with the direct, undistracted attention one final time. "I've watched it reveal cruelty in people I respected. I've watched it reveal cowardice in people I liked. I've watched it reveal genuine character in people nobody expected anything from." He paused. "The revealing isn't the end. It's just the beginning of what you decide to do with what's been revealed." Another pause. "That part is entirely yours." He walked. He did not look back. Ethan stood on the sidewalk and watched him go and felt something shift in his chest, not dramatically, not in the way that movies would require, but in the quiet cellular way that real things shift when they finally settle into their true position. He took the train to Penn Station that evening. He bought a ticket to Columbus, Ohio. He called his father from the platform, and his father answered on the second ring with the particular, slightly breathless quality of someone who has not been expecting a call and is therefore completely present for it. "Ethan," his father said. "Hey, Dad," Ethan said. And that was enough for a moment. Just the two words. Just the acknowledgement of each other across the distance. "I'm coming to see you," Ethan said. "If that's all right. I'd like to come for a while, not just a visit." A pause on the other end, not surprise exactly, more like the careful receipt of something hoped for but not counted on. "How long is a while?" his father asked. "I don't know yet," Ethan said. "Long enough to figure some things out." His father was quiet for a moment. "I'll make up the room," he said. "You don't have to." "I want to," his father said simply, and the simplicity of it, the uncomplicated willingness of a person who loves someone and shows it through practical action rather than performance, landed somewhere in Ethan that had been closed for a long time. He boarded the train. He put his two phones in his jacket pocket, and he sat by the window, and the city moved past him, and then the city became the spaces between cities, and then it became Ohio, flat and wide and entirely unconcerned with Wall Street or SEC findings or Delaware LLCs or any version of anything Ethan had spent 15 years telling himself was the measure of a life worth having. He sat with it. The sky outside the window was the particular color it gets in the late afternoon in October over the Midwest, wide and pale and full of a light that doesn't exist in cities because cities interrupt it. He had forgotten what that light looked like. He had been in cities long enough that he had stopped knowing what he was missing. He thought about Claire standing at the press conference podium in her dark blue dress. He thought about her voice saying the quiet morning before. He thought about what it meant to be ready in advance, to have your eyes open before you needed them open. I thought about the woman Barbara from Connecticut, 61 years old, 32 years of marriage, coming through the door of the Clear Account Project with a story she had practiced telling until it no longer broke her apart, and finding on the other side of the door someone who already knew the shape of it. He thought about the 60%. Not all, but not nothing. He thought about what you built in a pause. His father was standing on the platform when the train pulled in. He was wearing the brown jacket he had owned for at least a decade, and he looked older than Ethan had let himself track, and he was standing with the particular physical patience of someone who has been waiting and does not mind it, because the thing they are waiting for is worth waiting for. Ethan stepped off the train. His father looked at him, not at the suit. Ethan was not wearing a suit, was wearing a jacket and jeans the first time he had arrived anywhere without a suit in 15 years, and had not felt diminished by the absence. His father looked at him, at his son's face, with the clear, unperformative attention that Ethan now recognized as something he had grown up surrounded by and had spent his adult life in the most painful possible irony trying to find in rooms where it had never existed. "You look tired," his father said. "I am tired," Ethan said. His father put a hand on his shoulder, briefly, the way you hold something briefly when you want it to know it's held. "Come on," he said. "I made dinner." They drove home in the particular comfortable silence of people who know each other at the molecular level, who have shared enough time and enough quiet that conversation is not required to fill it. At the dinner table, his father asked no questions about the SEC, about the firm, about the divorce, about any of the architecture of the year that had just passed. He asked whether Ethan still liked green beans. Ethan said he did. His father served green beans. And that was the meal. Simple food at a simple table with his father, who had built his version of a life through 31 years of showing up for the people immediately in front of him, which was the only building strategy that had ever produced something that lasted. Ethan ate. He slept that night in the room his father had made up with the particular quality of sleep that comes when the managing has genuinely stopped. Not the shallow strategy-adjacent rest of someone who has set aside one problem to address another, the actual thing. He woke up without an alarm. He sat at his father's kitchen table in the morning with coffee and no phones and no document on the table, except a legal pad on which, over the course of an hour, he wrote a letter to Gerald Merritt that was not reviewed by Howard Cass before sending. He wrote about what it had meant to find out about the voluntary statement. He wrote it plainly, without craft, without the professional register he had deployed for 15 years. He wrote it the way his father would have written it, which was the way his father spoke directly without performance, saying the thing that was true. He thanked Gerald. He said he understood that the statement had not been an expression of approval and was not an invitation to resume any professional relationship. He said he understood that it had been an act of genuine character, of seeing the complete person rather than only the worst choices, and that it had cost Gerald something to submit it, and that the cost was not lost on him. He said he intended to be worth the statement over time, in whatever rebuilt form that looked like. He sealed the letter. He drove to the post office. He sent it. Then he drove back to his father's house, and he parked in the driveway, and he sat in the car for a moment, just a moment, and he thought about the courtroom one more time, not the strategy, not the documentation, not the regulatory outcome, not the laugh which still lived in him with a specific quality of shame that he understood he would need to sit with for a long time. He thought about the moment before the laugh. He thought about Claire's face when she had held his gaze for the last time, the complete clarity of it, the absence of performance, the specific quality of a person who has seen you fully, who has waited to see all of you, and who has decided with full information that the decision they are making is the right one. She had not looked at him with hatred. She had not looked at him with satisfaction. She had looked at him with the particular costly compassion of someone who loved you and grieved what you chose and would not carry it for you. And then she had looked away, and then she had walked out with her father into whatever she was going to build, and she had not looked back. He sat in his father's driveway in Ohio and understood finally at the cellular level what the old man had meant in the courtroom hallway when he said it. Not knowing is not the same as not choosing. He had chosen. He had chosen poorly, deliberately, over a period of years, while the woman he had categorized as ordinary sat beside him and chose every single day to be exactly who she was. He sat with it. He did not try to reframe it. He walked into his father's house. He said, "Do you need help with anything today?" His father looked up from the newspaper. "The back steps need repairing," he said. "I've been putting it off." "I'll do it," Ethan said. "You know how to fix steps." "No," Ethan said, "but I can learn." His father looked at him for a moment. Then he set down his newspaper. "I'll show you," he said. And that was where it began. Not in a courtroom, not in a regulatory document, not in the ruins of a career that had been built on the wrong foundation. It began in a quiet house in Ohio with a father who had waited and a son who had finally stopped running from the simplest, most demanding truth that a life can ask of you. The truth that who you are when no one is watching is the only version of yourself that ever actually counts. Claire Whitmore had known that from the beginning. She had simply been patient enough to let Ethan discover it for himself. And in a conference room back in New York, surrounded by women who had come through doors looking for the morning, Richard Whitmore had described the quiet morning before, when you understand exactly what you have. She was already building the thing that would outlast every story anyone would ever tell about what had happened between them. She was building it one woman at a time with full attention, with the organization of someone who had signed documents she hadn't read and understood what it cost, and decided that cost would mean something. She was building it on solid ground, and it would stand.